So, Stargirl's getting good. We're going to do chapters 14 and 15. This was the start of a period that blurs as I try to recall it. Incidents seem to cascade and merge. Events become feelings. Feelings become events. Head and heart are contrary historians. The hot seat session was never aired. Mr. Robinow destroyed the tape. Of course, that didn't stop every moment of it from being reported. In fact, most of the students knew about it by the time school opened the next day. What I recall then, when the last detail had been spilled, is a period of whispers and waiting, tension. What would happen now? Would the jury's open hostility spill over into the classrooms? How would Stargirl react? Answers were expected on the following day, Valentine's Day. On previous holidays, Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Groundhog Day, Stargirl had left a little something on each desk in her homeroom. Would she do likewise this time? The answer was yes. Each member of Homeroom 17 found a candy heart on his or her desk that morning. There was a basketball game that night. That I do remember. The biggest game of the year. The Electrons had breezed through the regular season undefeated, but now the second season was about to begin, the playoffs. First the districts, then the regionals, and finally the state tournament. We had never even made it to the districts, but now visions of championships danced in our heads. The Electrons, champions of all Arizona, would settle for nothing less. First hurdle in our way was Sun Valley, champions of the Pima League. This game was played Valentine's night on a neutral court in Casa Grande. All of Micah, it seemed, emptied out and headed for the game. Kevin and I went in the pickup. From the moment the Micah mob entered the gym, our cheers rattled the rafters. The big green M on Stargirl's white sweater flounced as she spun and leaped with the other cheerleaders. I spent as much time watching her as I did watching the game. She cheered when we scored. When Sun Valley scored, she did not. Something inside me felt better. But not for long. We were losing. For the first time all year, we were trailing at the end of the first quarter. In fact, we were getting smoked, 21-9. The reason was no mystery. While Sun Valley's team was not as good as ours, they did have one thing we did not, a superstar. A kid named Ron Kovac. He stood 6'8" and averaged 30 points per game. Our players looked like 5 Davids flailing against Goliath. Sun Valley's lead had increased to 19 points midway through the second quarter. Our once raucous fans were stunned into silence, and that's when it happened. The ball was loose in the middle of the floor. Several players from each team dived for it. At that moment, Kovac was running past, trying to avoid the divers, and his right foot came down on a prone player's sneaker. So it was told in the newspapers the next day. At the time, it happened so fast no one saw it, though several people said they heard a sickening crack like a twig snapping. All we knew was that suddenly Goliath was on the floor writhing and screaming, and his right foot looked all wrong. And the Sun Valley coaches and trainer and players were sprinting across the floor. But they were not the first. Stargirl, somehow, was already there. While Kovac's own cheerleaders sat gaping and stricken on their bench, Stargirl knelt on the hardwood floor. She held his head in her lap while the others attended to his broken leg. Her hands moved over his face and forehead. She seemed to be saying things to him. When they carried him away on a stretcher, she followed. Everyone, both sides, stood and applauded. The Sun Valley cheerleaders leaped as if he had just scored 2 points. Ambulance lights flashed in the high windows. I knew why I was applauding, but I wondered about some of the other Micah fans. Were they really standing in tribute, or because they were happy to see him go? The game resumed. Stargirl returned to the cheerleaders' bench. Without Kovac, Sun Valley was a pushover. By early in the second half, we took the lead and went on to win easily. 2 nights later, we lost to Glendale. Again, we fell farther and farther behind as the first half went on, but this time there was no turnaround in the second half. This time the Electrons faced not 1, but 5 players better than themselves. This time no opponent broke an ankle, though I'm sure in our desperation some of us secretly wished for it. We were shocked. We couldn't believe it. And then, as the seconds of the fourth quarter ticked by, we did believe. The cheers from across the gym were like volleys of arrows piercing our grand delusion. How could we have been so stupid? Did we really think that little Micah, undefeated in its own third-rate league, could ever stand up to the big city powerhouses around the state? We had been lured into great, foolish expectations, suckered. We were devastated. It had been so wonderful to be winners, and so right for us. Winning, we had come to believe, was our destiny. And now, as the Glendale coach sent in the scrubs to mop us up, Micah girls wept. Boys cursed and booed. Some blamed the officials, or the nets, or the lights. The cheerleaders, to their credit, kept on cheering. They looked up at us with glistening eyes and mascara on their cheeks. They pumped their arms and shouted and did everything that cheerleaders are supposed to do, but their gestures were empty, their hearts not in it, except for Stargirl. As I watched her intently, I could see that she was different. Her cheeks were dry. There was no crack in her voice, no sag in her shoulders. From the start of the second half on, she never sat down, and she never again looked at the game. She turned her back to the court. She stood and faced us and gave not an ounce of herself to the jubilation across the gym. We were losing by 30 points. With a minute to go, she cheered on as if we had a chance. Her eyes blazed with a ferocity I had never seen before. She shook her fist at us. She flung in her defiance at our gloom. And then her face was bloody. A Glendale player had just dunked the ball, and Kevins pounded my knee with his fist, and I looked to see Stargirl's face, suddenly a bloody mask, and I was on my feet, screaming, "No!" But it wasn't blood. It was a tomato. Someone had splattered her face with a perfectly thrown ripe tomato, and as the clock expired, the Glendale fans poured onto the court. Stargirl just stood there, her great eyes staring up at us in utter bewilderment through the pulpy red gore. Spouts of bitter laughter erupted among us, even some applause. The next morning at home, I found the card. It was in a school notebook that apparently I had not opened for several days. It was a Valentine, one of those little cut-out third-grade sorts, showing a blushing little boy and a girl with Mary Jane shoes and a big red heart between them and the words, "I love you." And as third-graders and high schoolers often do, the sender had signed it in code. Which, look at our cover. Look at the star on our cover. The star on the cover is above her head. And the star on that Valentine is next to her. And now we're on chapter 15. She gave everybody in school a card. That was my first thought. When I saw Kevin at school, I was about to ask him, but I pulled back. I waited until lunch. I tried to be casual. I slipped it in with the only thing that mattered that day. The school was in mourning. The game, the loss, the tomato. Oh yeah, incidentally speaking of Stargirl, did you happen to get a card? He looked at me funny. She gave them to her homeroom, I heard. Yeah, I said. That's what I heard too. But was that all? Didn't she give them to everybody else? He shrugged. Not to me. Why, you got one? He was looking away across the lunchroom, biting into his sandwich. Yet I felt he was grilling me. I shook my head. Oh no, just wondering. Actually, I was sitting on the card. It was in the back pocket of my jeans. Meanwhile, all eyes in the lunchroom were on Stargirl. I think we half expected to see traces of red still clinging to her face. She sat at her usual table with Dory Dilson and several other friends. She seemed subdued. She did not play her ukulele. She did not play with her rat. She just ate and talked with the girls at her table. As the lunch period was ending, she got up but did not head straight for the exit. Instead, she detoured in the direction of my table. I panicked. I jumped up, grabbed my stuff, blurted, "Gotta go," left Kevin with his mouth hanging, and took off. Not fast enough. Halfway to the door, I heard her behind me. "Hi, Leo." My face got warm. I was sure every eye was turned to me. I was sure they could all see the card in my pocket. I pretended to look at the clock. I pretended I was late for something. I ran from the lunchroom. I lurked in the shadows for the rest of the day. I went straight home after school. I stayed in my home. I came out only for dinner. I told my parents I had a project to do. I paced. I lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling. I stared out the window. I laid the card on my study desk. I picked it up. I read it. I read it. I read it. I played "Hi, Leo" over and over in my head. I tossed darts at the corkboard on the back of my door. My father called in. "What's your project, Darts?" I went out. I drove around in the pickup. I drove down her street. At the last intersection before her house, I turned off. 4 hours I lay under my sheet of moonlight. Her voice came through the night, from the light, from the stars. "Hi, Leo." In the morning, it was a Saturday, Kevin and I went together to Archie's for the weekly meeting of the Loyal Order of the Stone Bone. There were about 15 of us. We wore our fossil necklaces. Archie wanted to discuss the Eocene skull he was holding, but all the others could talk about was the game. When they told Archie about the tomato, his eyebrows went up, but other than that, his face did not change at all. I thought, this was not news to him. He already knows. Archie spent the whole session that way, nodding and smiling and raising his eyebrows. We dumped our disappointment on him, the devastation of the loss. He said very little. When it was over, he looked down at the skull in his lap and patted it and said, "Well, this fellow here lost his game too. He was winning for 10 million years or so, but then the early grasses started growing up around him and he found himself in a different league. He hung in there as well as he could. He scored his points, but he kept falling further and farther behind. The opposition was better, quicker, keener, and the championship game, our boy got annihilated. Not only didn't he show up for class the next day, he never showed up, period. They never saw him again." Archie lifted a snouted, box-sized skull until it was a side-by-side with his own face. A good minute passed as he said nothing, inviting us into our own thoughts, faces staring at faces at faces. Tens of millions of years of faces in a living room in a place called Arizona. And that is the end of chapter 15. Well, lots of stuff is happening here. I wonder, does Leo want Stargirl to like him? Is he trying to run because he's embarrassed? Maybe he doesn't want a girlfriend, or maybe he doesn't want it to be Stargirl. Or maybe he likes Stargirl and maybe he doesn't want to admit that to people. And when Archie was talking about the skull and using a metaphor of the dinosaur's existence and comparing that maybe to Stargirl's existence, when he said, let me find it, when he got annihilated, and not only did he show up for class the next day, he never showed up, period. That makes me wonder, in the next chapter, is that what Stargirl's going to do? Is her existence going to kind of be snuffed out like the dinosaurs? Did Mr. Archie know all of these things? We don't know. So, thanks for listening. See you back next video.